Chapter 22 of The Two-Gun Man by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Penn. Keeping a Promise. Ferguson's dreams had been troubled. Long before dawn he was awake and outside the bunkhouse, splashing water over his face from the tin wash basin that stood on the bench just outside the door. Before breakfast he had saddled and bridled Mustard, and directly after the meal he was in the saddle, riding slowly toward the river. Before very long he was riding through Bear Flat, and after a time he came to the hill where, only 2 short days before, he had reveled in the supreme happiness that had followed months of hope and doubt. It did not seem as though it had been only 2 days. It seemed that time was playing him a trick, yet he knew that today was like yesterday. Each day like its predecessor, that if the hours dragged it was because in the bitterness of his soul he realized that today could not be, for him, like the day before yesterday, and that succeeding days gave no promise of restoring to him the happiness that he had lost. He saw the sun rising above the rim of hills that surrounded the flat. He climbed to the rock upon which he had sat, with her, watching the shadows retreat to the mountains, watching the sun stream down into the clearing and upon the Radford cabin. But there was no longer beauty in the picture, for him. Hereafter he would return to that life he had led of old, the old hard life that he had known before his brief romance had given him a fleeting glimpse of what might have been. Many times, when his hopes had been high, he had felt a chilling fear that he would never be able to reach the pinnacle of promise, that in the end fate would place before him a barrier, the barrier in the shape of his contract with Stafford that he had regretted many times. Mary Radford would never believe his protest that he had not been hired to kill her brother. Fate, in the shape of Leviatt, had forestalled him there. Many times, when she had questioned him regarding the hero in her story, he had been on the point of taking her into his confidence as to the reason of his presence at the Two Diamond, but he had always put it off, hoping that things would be righted in the end and that he would be able to prove to her the honesty of his intentions. But now that time was past. Whatever happened now, she would believe him the creature that she despised, that all men despised, the man who strikes in the dark. This, then, was to be the end. He could not say that he had been entirely blameless. He should have told her. But it was not the end that he was now contemplating. There could be no end until there had been an accounting between him and Leviatt. Perhaps the men who had shot Ben Radford in the back would never be known. He had his suspicions, but they availed nothing. In the light of present circumstances, Miss Radford would never hold him guiltless. Until near noon he had sat on the rock on the crest of the hill, the lines of his face growing more grim, his anger slowly giving way to the satisfying calmness that comes when the mind has reached a conclusion. There would be a final scene with Leviatt, and then... He rose from the rock, made his way deliberately down the hillside, mounted his pony, and struck the trail leading to the Two Diamond ranch house. About noon, Leviatt and Tucson rode into the Two Diamond corral gate, dismounted from their ponies, and proceeded to the bunkhouse for dinner. The men of the outfit were already at the table, and after washing their faces from the tin wash basin on the bench outside the door, Leviatt and Tucson entered the bunkhouse and took their places. Greetings were given and returned through the medium of short nods. With several of the men, even this was omitted. Leviatt was not a popular range boss, and there were some of the men who had whispered their suspicions that the death of Rope Jones had not been brought about in the regular way. Many of them remembered the incident that had occurred between Rope, the range boss, Tucson, and the new stray man, and though opinions differed, there were some who held that the death of Rope might have resulted from the ill feeling engendered by the incident. But in the absence of proof, there was nothing to be done. So, those men who had suspicions wisely refrained from talking in public. Before the meal was finished, the blacksmith poked his head in through the open doorway, calling, "Old man wants to see Leviatt up in the office." The blacksmith's head was withdrawn before Leviatt, who had heard the voice but had not seen the speaker, could raise his voice in reply. He did not hasten, however, and remained at the table with Tucson for 5 minutes after the other men had left. Then, with a final word to Tucson, he rose and strode carelessly to the door of Stafford's office. The latter had been waiting with some impatience, and at the appearance of the range boss, he shoved his chair back from his desk and arose. "Just come in?" he questioned. "Just come in," repeated Leviatt, drawling. "Plumb starved. Had to eat before I come down here." He entered and dropped lazily into a chair near the desk, stretching his legs comfortably. He had observed in Stafford's manner certain signs of a subdued excitement, and while he affected not to notice this, there was a glint of feline humor in his eyes. "Somebody said you wanted me?" he said. "Anything doing?" Stafford had held in as long as he could. Now he exploded. "What in hell do you suppose I sent for you for?" he demanded, as, walking to and fro in the room, he paused and glared down at the range boss. "Where you been? We're 20 calves and a dozen cows short on the tally." Leviatt looked up, his eyes suddenly flashing. "Whew!" he exclaimed. "They're hitting them pretty heavy lately. When was they missed?" Stafford spluttered impotently. "Night before last," he flared. "And not a damn sign of where they went." Leviatt grinned coldly. "Them rustlers is getting to be pretty slick, ain't they?" he drawled. Stafford's face swelled with a rage that threatened to bring on apoplexy. He brought a tense fist heavily down upon his desk top. "Slick?" he sneered. "I don't reckon they're any slick. It's that I got a no-good outfit. There ain't a man in the bunch could see a rustler if he hobbled a cow and was running her calf off before their eyes." He hesitated to gain breath before continuing. "What have I got an outfit for? What have I got a range boss for? What have I got—" Leviatt grinned wickedly, and Stafford hesitated, his hand upraised. "Your stray man doing anything these days?" questioned Leviatt significantly. "'Cause if he is," resumed Leviatt before the manager could reply, "he ought to manage to be around where them thieves are working." Stafford stiffened. He had developed a liking for the stray man, and he caught a note of venom in Leviatt's voice. "I reckon the stray man knows what he's doing," he replied. He returned to his chair beside the desk, and sat in it, facing Leviatt and speaking with heavy sarcasm. "The stray man's the only one in the whole bunch that's doing anything," he said. "Sure," sneered Leviatt. "He's getting paid for sparking Mary Radford." "Maybe he is," returned Stafford. "I don't know as I blame him any for that. But he's been doing something else now and then, too." "Finding the man that's been rustling your stock, for instance," mocked Leviatt. Stafford leaned back in his chair, frowning. "Look here, Leviatt," he said steadily. "I might have spoke a little strong to you about them missing cattle, but I reckon you're partly to blame. If you'd been minded to help Ferguson a little instead of acting like a fool because you thought he's took a shine to Mary Radford, we might have been further along with them rustlers. As it is, Ferguson's been playing a lone hand, but he claims to have been doing something. He ain't been in the habit of blowing his own horn, and I reckon we can rely on what he says. I'm wanting you to keep the boys together this afternoon, for we might need 'em to help Ferguson out. He's promised to ride in today and show me the man who's been rustling my cattle." Leviatt's lips slowly straightened. He sat more erect, and when he spoke the mockery had entirely gone from his voice and from his manner. "He's going to do what?" he questioned coldly. "Show me the man who's been rustling my cattle," repeated Stafford. For a brief space neither man spoke, nor moved. Stafford's face wore the smile of a man who has just communicated some unexpected and astonishing news and was watching its effect with suppressed enjoyment. He knew that Leviat felt bitter toward the stray man, that the news that the latter might succeed in doing the thing that he had set out to do would not be received with any degree of pleasure by the range boss. But, watching closely, Stafford was forced to admit that Leviat did not feel so strongly, or was cleverly repressing his emotions. There was no sign on the range boss's face that he had been hurt by the news. His face had grown slightly paler, and there was a hard glitter in his narrowed eyes, but his voice was steady. "Well, now," he said, "that ought to tickle you a heap." "I won't be none disappointed," returned Stafford. Leviat looked sharply at him and crossed his arms over his chest. "When was you talking to him?" he questioned. "Yesterday." Leviat's lips moved slightly. "And when did you say them cattle was rustled?" he asked. "Night before last," returned Stafford. Leviat was silent for a brief time. Then he unfolded his arms and stood erect, his eyes boring into Stafford's. "When you expectin' Ferguson?" he questioned. "He didn't say just when he was comin' in," returned Stafford. "But I reckon we might expect him any time." Leviat strode to the door, looking back over his shoulder. He smiled evilly. "I'm much obliged for you tellin' me," he said. "We'll be ready for him." A little over an hour after his departure from the hill, Ferguson rode up to the Two Diamond corral gate and dismounted. Grouped around the door of the bunkhouse were several of the Two Diamond men. In a strip of shade from the blacksmith shop were others. Jocular words were hurled at him by some of the men as he drew the saddle from Mustard, for the stray man's quietness and invariable thoughtfulness had won him a place in the affections of many of the men, and their jocular greetings were evidence of this. He nodded shortly to them, but did not answer, and, instead of lugging his saddle to its accustomed peg in the lean-to, he threw it over the corral fence and left it. Then, without another look toward the men, he turned and strode toward the manager's office. The latter was seated at his desk, and looked up at the stray man's entrance. He opened his lips to speak, but closed them again, surprised at the stray man's appearance. During the months that Ferguson had worked at the Two Diamond, Stafford had not seen him as he looked at this moment. Never, during the many times the manager had seen him, had he been able to guess anything of the stray man's emotions by looking at his face. Now, however, there had come a change. In the set, tightly drawn lips were the telltale signs of an unutterable resolve. In the narrowed, steady eyes was a light that chilled Stafford like a cold breeze in the heat of a summer's day. In the man's whole body was something that shocked the manager into silence. He came into the room, standing near the door, his set lips moving a very little. "You heard anything from Leviat yet?" he questioned. "Why, yes," returned Stafford hesitatingly. "He was here talking to me. Ain't been gone more'n half an hour. I reckon he's somewhere around now." "You talking to him, you say?" said the stray man slowly. He smiled mirthlessly. "I reckon you told him about them missing calves?" "I sure did," returned Stafford, with much vehemence. He laughed harshly. "I told him more," he said. "I told him you was going to show me the man who'd rustled 'em." Ferguson's lips wreathed into a grim smile. "So you told him," he said. "I was expectin' you'd do that, if he got in before me. That's why I stopped in here. That was somethin' which I was wantin' him to know. I don't want it to be said I didn't give him a chance." Stafford rose from his chair, taking a step toward the stray man. "Why, what—" he began, but a look at the stray man's face silenced him. "I come over here today to show you the rustler I told you about yesterday. I'm goin' to look for him now. If he ain't sloped, I reckon you'll see him pretty soon." Leviat stepped down from the door of the manager's office and strode slowly toward the bunkhouse. On the way he passed several of the men, but he paid no attention to them, his face wearing an evil expression, his eyes glittering venomously. When he reached the bunkhouse, he passed several more of the men without a word, going directly to a corner of the room where sat Tucson and conversing earnestly with his friend. A little later, both he and Tucson rose and passed out of the bunkhouse, walking toward the blacksmith shop. After a little they appeared, again joining the group outside the bunkhouse. It was while Leviatt and Tucson were in the blacksmith shop that Ferguson had come in. When they came out again, the stray man had disappeared into the manager's office. Since the day when in the manager's office, Ferguson had walked across the floor to return to Leviatt the leather tobacco pouch that the latter had dropped in the depression on the ridge above the gully where the stray man had discovered the dead two-diamond cow and her calf. Leviatt had known that the stray man suspected him of being leagued with the rustlers. But this knowledge had not disturbed him. He felt secure because of his position. Even the stray man would have to have absolute damning evidence before he could hope to be successful in proving a range boss guilty of cattle stealing. Leviatt had been more concerned over the stray man's apparent success in courting Mary Radford. His hatred, beginning with the shooting match in Dry Bottom, had been intensified by the discovery of Ferguson on the Radford porch in Bear Flat, by the incident at the bunkhouse when Rope Jones had prevented Tucson from shooting the stray man from behind, and by the discovery that the latter suspected him of complicity with the cattle thieves. But it had reached its highest point when Mary Radford spurned his love. After that he had realized that just so long as the stray man lived and remained at the Two Diamond, there would be no peace or security for him there. Yet he had no thought of settling his differences with Ferguson as man to man. Twice had he been given startling proof of the stray man's quickness with the six-shooter, and each time his own slowness had been crushingly impressed on his mind. He was not fool enough to think he could beat the stray man at that game. But there were other ways. Rope Jones had discovered that, when it had been too late to profit. Rope had ridden into a carefully laid trap and, in spite of his reputation for quickness in drawing his weapon, had found that the old game of getting a man between two fires had proven efficacious. And now Leviatt and Tucson were to attempt the scheme again. Since his interview with Stafford, Leviatt had become convinced that the time for action had come. Ferguson had left word with the manager that he was to show the latter the rustler, and by that token Leviatt knew that the stray man had gathered evidence against him and was prepared to show him to the manager in his true light. He, in turn, had left a message with the manager for Ferguson. "We'll be ready for him," he had said. He did not know whether Ferguson had received this message. It had been a subtle thought. The words had been merely involuntary. By we, the manager had thought that he had meant that the entire outfit was to be held ready to apprehend the rustler. Leviatt had met only himself and Tucson, and they were ready. Down in the blacksmith shop, while Ferguson had ridden in and stepped into the manager's office, had Leviatt and Tucson made their plan. When they had joined the group in front of the bunkhouse, and had placed themselves in positions where 30 or 40 feet of space yawned between them, they had been making the first preparatory movement. The next would come when Ferguson appeared to carry out his intention of showing Stafford the rustler. To none of the men of the outfit did Leviatt or Tucson reveal anything of the nervousness that affected them. They listened to the rough jest. They laughed when the others laughed. They dropped an occasional word of encouragement. They even laughed at jokes in which there was no visible point. But they did not move from their places. Nor did they neglect to keep a sharp, alert eye out for the stray man's appearance. And when they saw him come out of the door of the office, they neglected to joke or laugh, but stood silent with the 30 or 40 feet of space between them, their faces paling a little, their hearts laboring a little harder. When Ferguson stepped out of the door of the office, Stafford followed. The stray man had said enough to arouse the manager's suspicions, and there was something about the stray man's movements which gave the impression that he contemplated something more than merely pointing out the thief. If warning of impending tragedy had ever shone in a man's eyes, Stafford was certain that it had shone in the stray man's during the brief time that he had been in the office, and when he had stepped down from the door. Stafford had received no invitation to follow the stray man, but impelled by the threat in the latter's eyes, and by the hint of cold resolution that gave promise of imminent tragedy, he stepped down also, trailing the stray man at a distance of 20 yards. Ferguson did not hesitate once in his progress toward the bunkhouse, except to cast a rapid, searching glance toward a group of 2 or 3 men who lounged in the shade of the eaves of the building. Passing the blacksmith's shop, he continued toward the bunkhouse, walking with a steady stride, looking neither to the right or left. Other men in the group besides Leviatt and Tucson had seen the stray man coming, and as he came nearer, the talk died and a sudden silence fell. Ferguson came to a point within 10 feet of the group of men who were ranged along the wall of the bunkhouse. Stafford had come up rapidly, and he now stood near a corner of the bunkhouse in an attitude of intense attention. He was in a position where he could see the stray man's face, and he marveled at the sudden change that had come into it. The tragedy had gone, and though the hard lines were still around his mouth, the corners twitched a little, as though moved by a cold, feline humor. There was a hint of mockery in his eyes, a chilling mockery, much like that which the manager had seen in the months before, when in Dry Bottom the stray man had told Leviatt that he thought he was a plum man. But now Stafford stood breathless as he heard the stray man's voice, directed at Leviatt. "I reckon you think you've been some busy lately," he drawled. Meaningless words, as they appear here, meaningless to the group of men and to the Two Diamond manager. Yet to Leviatt they were burdened with a dire significance. They told him that the stray man was aware of his duplicity. They meant, perhaps, that the stray man knew of his dealings with the cattle thieves whom he had visited yesterday in the hills near the river. Whatever Leviatt thought, there was significance enough in the words to bring a sneering smile to his face. "Meanin'?" he questioned, his eyes glittering evilly. Ferguson smiled, his eyes unwavering and narrowing a very little as they met those of his questioner. Deliberately, as though the occasion were one of unquestioned peace, he drew out some tobacco and several strips of rice paper. Selecting one of the strips of paper, he returned the others to a pocket and proceeded to roll a cigarette. His movements were very deliberate. Stafford watched him, fascinated by his coolness. In the tense silence, no sound was heard except a subdued rattle of pans in the bunkhouse, telling that the cook and his assistant were at work. The cigarette was made finally, and then the stray man lighted it and looked again at Leviatt, ignoring his question, asking another himself. "You working down the crick yesterday?" he said. "Up," snapped Leviatt. The question had caught him off his guard, or he would have evaded it. He had told the lie out of pure perverseness. Ferguson took a long pull at his cigarette. "Well, now," he returned, "that's mighty peculiar. I'd 'a' swore I seen you and Tucson riding down the river yesterday. Thought I saw you in a basin in the hills, talking to some men that I'd never seen before. I reckon I was mistaken, but I'd 'a' swore that I seen you." Leviatt's face was colorless. Standing with his profile to Tucson, he closed one eye furtively. This had been a signal that had previously been agreed upon. Tucson caught it and turned slightly, letting one hand fall to his right hip, immediately above the butt of his pistol. "Hell!" sneered Leviatt. "You're seeing a heap of things since you've been running with Mary Radford." Ferguson laughed mockingly. "Maybe I have," he returned. "Riding with her sure makes a man open his eyes considerable." Now he ignored Leviatt, speaking to Stafford. "When I was in here one day talking to you," he said quietly, "you told me about you and Leviatt going to Dry Bottom to hire a gunfighter. I reckon you told that right?" "I sure did," returned Stafford. Ferguson took another pull at his cigarette. blowing the smoke slowly skyward, and he drawled again, so that there was a distinct space between the words. "I reckon you didn't go around advertising that?" he asked. Stafford shook his head negatively. "There ain't anyone around here knowed anything about that but me and you and Leviatt," he returned. Ferguson grinned coldly. "And yet it's got out," he stated quietly. "I reckon if no one but us three knowed about it, one of us has been gassin'. I wouldn't think that you'd done any gassin'," he added, speaking to Stafford. The latter slowly shook his head. Ferguson continued, his eyes cold and alert. "And I reckon that I ain't shot off about it, unless I've been dreamin'. According to that, it must have been Leviatt who told Mary Radford that I'd been hired to kill her brother." Leviatt sneered. "Suppose I did," he returned, showing his teeth in a savage snarl. "What are you going to do about it?" "Nothing now," drawled Ferguson. "I'm glad to hear you ain't denying it." He spoke to Stafford without removing his gaze from the range boss. "Yesterday," he stated calmly, "I was riding down the river. I found a basin among the hills. There was a cabin down there. 4 men was talking in front of it. There was 20 calves and a dozen cows in a corral. 2 of the men was—" Leviatt's right hand dropped suddenly to his holster. His pistol was half out. Tucson's hand was also wrapped around the butt of his pistol. But before the muzzle of either man's gun had cleared its holster, there was a slight movement at the stray man's sides, and his 2 guns glinted in the white sunlight. There followed 2 reports, so rapidly that they blended. Smoke curled from the muzzles of the stray man's pistols. Tucson sighed, placed both hands to his chest, and pitched forward headlong, stretching his length in the sand. For an instant Leviatt stood rigid, his left arm swinging helplessly by his side, broken by the stray man's bullet, an expression of surprise and fear in his eyes. Then, with a sudden savage motion, he dragged again at his gun. One of the stray man's guns crashed again, sharply. Leviatt's weapon went off, its bullet throwing up sand in front of Ferguson. Leviatt's eyes closed, his knees doubled under him, and he pitched forward at Ferguson's feet. He was face down, his right arm outstretched, the pistol still in his hand. A thin blue wreath of smoke rose lazily from its muzzle. Ferguson bent over him, his weapon still in his hands. Leviatt's legs stretched slowly and then stiffened. In the strained silence that had followed the shooting, Ferguson stood, looking gloomily down upon the quiet form of his fallen adversary. "I reckon you won't lie no more about me," he said dully. Without a glance in the direction of the group of silent men, he sheathed his weapons and strode toward the ranch house. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Two-Gun Man by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Penn. At the Edge of the Cottonwood. Ferguson strode into the manager's office and dropped heavily into a chair beside the desk. He was directly in front of the open door, and looking up he could see the men down at the bunkhouse congregated around the bodies of Leviatt and Tucson. The end that he had been expecting for the past 2 days had come as he knew it must come. He had not been trapped as they had trapped Rope Jones. When he had stood before Leviatt in front of the bunkhouse, he had noted the positions of the 2 men, had seen that they had expected him to walk squarely into the net that they had prepared for him. His lips curled a little even now over the thought that the 2 men had held him so cheaply. Well, they had learned differently, when too late. It was the end of things for them, and for him the end of his hopes. When he had drawn his guns, he had thought of merely wounding Leviatt, intending to allow the men of the outfit to apply to him the penalty that all convicted cattle thieves must suffer. But before that he had hoped to induce Leviat to throw some light upon the attempted murder of Ben Radford. However, Leviat had spoiled all that when he had attempted to draw his weapon after he was wounded. He had given Ferguson no alternative. He had been forced to kill the only man who, he was convinced, could have given him any information about the shooting of Radford, and now, in spite of anything he might say to the contrary, Mary Radford, and even Ben himself, would always believe him guilty. He could not stay at Two Diamond now. He must get out of the country, back to the old life at the Lazy J, where, among his friends, he might finally forget. But he doubted much. Did men ever forget women they had loved? Some perhaps did, but he was certain that nothing, not even time, could dim the picture that was now in his mind. The hill and the flat, the girl sitting upon the rock beside him, her eyes illuminated with a soft, tender light, her breeze-blown hair, which he had kissed, which the sun gods had kissed as, coming down from the mountains, they had bathed the hill with the golden light of the evening. He had thought then that nothing could prevent him from enjoying the happiness which that afternoon seemed to have promised. He had watched the sun sinking behind the mountains, secure in the thought that the morrow would bring him added happiness. But now there could be no tomorrow, for him. 15 minutes later Stafford entered the office to find the stray man still seated in the chair, his head bowed in his hands. He did not look up as the manager entered, and the latter stepped over to him and laid a friendly hand on his shoulder. "I'm thanking you for what you done for me," he said. Ferguson rose, leaning one hand on the back of the chair upon which he had been sitting. The manager saw that deep lines had come into his face, that his eyes, always steady before, were restless and gleaming with an expression which seemed unfathomable. But he said nothing until the manager had seated himself beside the desk. Then he took a step and stood looking into Stafford's upturned face. "I reckon I've done what I come here to do," he said grimly. "I'm taking my time now." Stafford's face showed a sudden disappointment. "Shucks," he returned, unable to keep the regret from his voice. "Ain't things suited you here?" The stray man grinned with straight lips. He could not let the manager know his secret. "Things have suited me mighty well," he declared. "I'm thanking you for having made things pleasant for me while I've been here. But I done what I contracted to do, and there ain't anything more to keep me here. If you'll give me my time, I'll be going." Stafford looked up at him with a sly, significant smile. "Why," he said, "Leviat told me you'd found something real interesting over on Bear Flat. Now, I shouldn't think you'd want to run away from her." The stray man's lips whitened a little. "I don't think Mary Radford is worrying about me," he said steadily. "Well, now," returned Stafford, serious again, "then I reckon Leviat had it wrong." "I expect he had it wrong," answered the stray man shortly. But Stafford did not yield. He had determined to keep the stray man at the Two Diamond, and there were other arguments that he had not yet advanced which might cause him to stay. He looked up again, his face wearing a thoughtful expression. "I reckon you remember our contract?" he questioned. The stray man nodded. "I was to find out who was stealing your cattle," he said. Stafford smiled slightly. "Correct," he returned. "You've showed me 2 thieves. But a while ago I heard you say there was 2 more. Our contract ain't fulfilled till you show me them 2, you reckon?" The stray man drew a deep, resigned breath. "I expect that's right," he admitted. "But I told you where you can find them. All you got to do is ride over there and catch them." Stafford's smile widened a little. "Sure," he returned. "That's all I got to do, and I'm going to do it. But I'm wanting my range boss to take charge of the outfit that's going over to catch them." "Your range boss?" said Ferguson, a flash of interest in his eyes. "Why, your range boss ain't here any more." Stafford leaned forward, speaking seriously. "I'm talking to my range boss right now," he said significantly. Ferguson started, and a tinge of slow color came into his face. He drew a deep breath and took a step forward, but suddenly he halted, his lips straightening again. "I'm thanking you," he said slowly, "but I'm leaving the Two Diamond." He drew himself up, looking on the instant more his old, indomitable self. "I'm carrying out our contract, though," he added. "If you're wanting me to go after them other two men, I ain't backing out. But you're taking charge of the outfit. I ain't going to be your range boss." An hour later 10 of the Two Diamond men, accompanied by Stafford and the stray man, loped their horses out on the plains toward the river. It was a grim company on a grim mission, and the men forbore to joke as they rode through the dust and sunshine of the afternoon. Ferguson rode slightly in advance, silent, rigid in the saddle, not even speaking to Stafford, who rode near him. Half an hour after leaving the Two Diamond, they rode along the crest of a ridge of hills above Bear Flat. They had been riding here only a few minutes when Stafford, who had been watching the stray man, saw him start suddenly. The manager turned and followed the stray man's gaze. Standing on a porch in front of a cabin on the other side of the flat was a woman. She was watching them, her hands shading her eyes. Stafford saw the stray man suddenly dig his spurs into his pony's flanks, saw a queer pallor come over his face. 5 minutes later they had ridden down through a gully to the plains. Thereafter, even the hard-riding Two Diamond boys found it difficult to keep near the stray man. Something over 2 hours later, the Two Diamond outfit, headed by the stray man, clattered down into a little basin where Ferguson had seen the cabin 2 days before. As the Two Diamond men came to within 100 feet of the cabin, 2 men, who had been at work in a small corral, suddenly dropped their branding irons and bolted toward the cabin. But before they had time to reach the door, the Two Diamond men had surrounded them, sitting grimly and silently in their saddles. Several of Stafford's men had drawn their weapons, but were now returning them to their holsters, for neither of the 2 men was armed. They stood within the grim circle, embarrassed, their heads bowed, their attitude revealing their shame at having been caught so easily. One of the men, a clear, steady-eyed fellow, laughed frankly. "Well, we're plumb easy, ain't we, boys?" he said, looking around at the silent group. "Corralled us without letting off a gun. That's what I'd call ridiculous. You're right welcome. But maybe you wouldn't have had things so easy if we hadn't left our guns in the cabin, eh, Bill?" he questioned, prodding the other man playfully in the ribs. But the other man did not laugh. He stood before them, his embarrassment gone, his eyes shifting and fearful. "Shut up, you damn fool!" he snarled. But the clear-eyed man gave no attention to this outburst. "You're Two Diamond men, ain't you?" he asked, looking full at Ferguson. The latter nodded, and the clear-eyed man continued. "Knowed you right off," he declared with a laugh. "Leviatt pointed you out to me one day when you was riding right out yonder." He jerked a thumb toward the distance. "Leviatt told me about you. Wanted to try and plug you with his 6, but decided you was too far away." He laughed self-accusingly. "If you'd been half an hour later, I reckon you wouldn't have proved your stock. But we loafed a heap, and half that bunch ain't got our brand." "We didn't need to look at no brand," declared Stafford grimly. The clear-eyed man started a little. Then he laughed. "Then you must have got Leviatt in Tucson," he said. He turned to Ferguson. "If Leviatt has been got," he said, "it must have been you that got him. He told me he was running in with you some day. I kept telling him to be careful." Ferguson's eyelashes twitched a little. "Thank you for the compliment," he said. "Oh, hell!" declared the man, sneering. "I wasn't mushin' none." Stafford had made a sign to the men, and some of them dismounted and approached the 2 rustlers. The man who had profanely admonished the other to silence made some little resistance, but in the end he stood within the circle, his hands tied behind him. The clear-eyed man made no resistance, seeming to regard the affair in the light of a huge joke. Once, while the Two Diamond men worked at his hands, he told them to be careful not to hurt him. "I'm going to be hurt enough after a while," he added. There was nothing more to be done. The proof of guilt was before the Two Diamond men, in the shape of several calves in the small corral that still bore the Two Diamond brand. Several of the cows were still adorned with the Two Diamond earmark, and in addition to this was Ferguson's evidence. Therefore the men's ponies were caught up, saddled, and the two men forced to mount. Then the entire company rode out of the little gully through which the Two Diamond outfit had entered, riding toward the cottonwood that skirted the river miles away. A little while before sunset the cavalcade rode to the edge of the cottonwood. Stafford halted his pony and looked at Ferguson, but the stray man had seen enough tragedy for one day, and he shook his head, sitting gloomily in the saddle. "I'm waiting here," he said simply. "There'll be enough in there to do it without me." The clear-eyed man looked at him with a grim smile. "Well, hell," he said. "You ain't going in?" His eyes lighted for an instant. "I reckon you're plumb white," he declared. "You ain't aiming to see any free show." "I'm saying so long to you," returned Ferguson. "You're game." A flash of admiration lighted his eyes. The clear-eyed man smiled enigmatically. "I'm staying game," he declared grimly, without boast. "And now I'm telling you something. Yesterday Leviatt told me he shot Ben Radford. He said he'd lied to Ben about you and that he shot him so his sister would think you done it. You've been white, and so I'm squaring things for you. I'm wishing you luck." For an instant he sat in the saddle, watching a new color surge into the stray man's face. Then his pony was led away through a tangle of undergrowth at the edge of the cottonwood. When Ferguson looked again, the little company had ridden into the shadow, but Ferguson could make out the clear-eyed man, still erect in his saddle, still seeming to wear an air of unstudied nonchalance. For a moment longer Ferguson saw him, and then he was lost in the shadows. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of The Two-Gun Man by Charles Alden Seltzer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Penn. The end of the story. 2 weeks later, Ferguson had occasion to pass through Bear Flat. Coming out of the flat near the cottonwood, he met Ben Radford. The latter, his shoulder mending rapidly, grinned genially at the stray man. "I'm right sorry I made that mistake, Ferguson," he said. "But Leviatt sure did give you a bad reputation." Ferguson smiled grimly. "He won't be saying bad things about anybody else," he said, and then his eyes softened. "But I'm some sorry for the cuss," he added. "He had it coming," returned Ben soberly. "And I'd rather it was him than me." He looked up at Ferguson, his eyes narrowing quizzically. "You ain't been around here for a long time," he said. "For a man who's just been promoted to range boss, you're unnaturally shy." Ferguson smiled. "I ain't parading around showing off," he returned. "Someone might take it into their head to bore me with a rifle bullet." Radford's grin broadened. "I reckon you're wasting valuable time," he declared. "For I happen to know that she wouldn't throw nothing worse than a posy at you." "You don't say," returned Ferguson seriously. "I reckon—" He abruptly turned his pony down the trail that led to the cabin. As he rode up to the porch there was a sudden movement, a rustle, a gasp of astonishment, and Mary Radford stood in the doorway looking at him. For a moment there was a silence that might have meant many things. Both were thinking rapidly over the events of their last meeting at this very spot. Then Ferguson moved uneasily in the saddle. "You got that there rifle anywheres handy?" he asked, grinning at her. Her eyes drooped. One foot nervously pushed out the hem of her skirts. Then she laughed, flushing crimson. "It wasn't loaded anyway," she said. The sunset was never more beautiful than today on the hill in Bear Flat. Mary Radford sat on the rock in her accustomed place, and, stretched out full length beside her, was Ferguson. He was looking out over the flat at the shadows of the evening that were advancing slowly toward the hill. She turned toward him, her eyes full and luminous. "I am almost at the end of my story," she said, smiling at him. "But," and her forehead wrinkled perplexedly, "I find the task of ending it more difficult than I had anticipated. It's a love scene," she added banteringly. "Do you think you could help me?" He looked up at her. I reckon I could help you in a real love scene, he said, but I ain't very good at pretending. But this is a real love scene, she replied stoutly. I am writing it as it actually occurred to me. I have reached the moment when the hero, has declared his love for me. Of course, with a blush, the heroine, and she has accepted him. But they are facing a problem. In the story, he has been a cowpuncher and, of course, has no permanent home. And, of course, the reader will expect me to tell how they lived after they had finally decided to make life's journey together. Perhaps you can tell me how the hero should go about it. Do you reckon that any reader is that inquisitive? He questioned. Why, of course. He looked anxiously at her. In that case, he said, maybe the reader would want to know what the heroine thought about it. Would she want to go back east to live? Taking her cowpuncher with her to show off to her eastern friends? She laughed. I thought you were not very good at pretending, she said. And here you are trying to worm a declaration of my intentions out of me. You did not need to go about that so slyly, she told him with an earnestness that left absolutely no doubt of her determination. For I am going to stay right here. Why, she added, taking a deep breath and a lingering glance at the rift in the mountains where the rose veil descended, I love the West. He looked at her, his eyes narrowing with sympathy. I reckon it's a pretty good little old country, he said. He smiled broadly. And now I'm telling you how to end your story, he said, by giving you the hero's plans for the future. I'm telling you that they ain't what you might call elaborate. But if your inquisitive reader must know about 'em, you might say that Stafford has given his hero, I'm meaning, of course, his range boss, $100 a month, being some tickled over what his range boss has done for him. And that there range boss knows when he's got a good thing. He's going to send a Cimarron for a lot of stuff, fixin's and things for the heroine, and he's going to make a proposition to Ben Radford to make his cabin a whole lot bigger. And then him and the heroine is going to live right there, right where the hero meets the heroine the first time, when he come there after being bit by a rattler. And then, if any little heroes or heroines come, they'd have... Her hand was suddenly over his mouth. Why, she protested, trying her best to look scornful. Do you imagine that I would think of putting such a thing as that in my book? He grinned guiltily. I don't know anything about writing, he said, properly humbled, but I reckon it wouldn't be any of the reader's business. The End. End of chapter 24. End of The Two-Gun Man by Charles Alden Seltzer.